and today is the beginning of many conversations with experts around mental health, where we share our own experiences, Chris and I, and bring an expert in to help. And today we will be beginning with Charity, who is our first guest.
Make sure that you get in on the conversation. You can DM a short video or send us a message to any of our social media platforms, being Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook. Everything is at MasiviweZA. I repeat, at MasiviweZA. Do make sure that you send it through those DMs. Do make sure that you send it through those messages. If you have any questions, do make sure that you send them through, and we'll try to get to each and every one of them as swift as possible. The Masiviwe movement as a group of organizations led by the Foundation for Professional Development, working together to make sure everyone is heard when it comes to mental health. So this program was made possible by the funding from the CDC. The guy that moved in unannounced and unprovoked in 2018 is a guy called PTSD. And I discovered that I was living with him when he had moved in and was living with me for weeks, you know. But I was very glad to have discovered him when I did discover him. And I think I'm here today because I did discover that he was living with me.
How did this guy come into your life? What was the reason that this guy decided that he was welcome?
I could say that everything that could go wrong in the year 2018 did go wrong for me. And I think PTSD moving in to live with me at the time was a result of this. You know, it was just me taking everything in. And I think me being the macho man that I am, not sharing. If I had shared and maybe have shared in time, I would have discovered him in time. But hey, we live and we learn. How I got to discover him was that I was no longer, hear me well, Neponi. I was not like looking to end my life or anything, but I was no longer going out of my way to keep myself alive. So one time I was driving, and I was driving to an interview, and it was an intersection, four-way stop. It became a four-way stop because robots were not working. I don't remember if it was load shedding or just a power outage, but yeah, it was then treated as a four-way stop. But then both myself and the Ranger Bakkie, which was on my right, decided to accelerate at the same time. And I mean, he's bigger, he's stronger, he's more fierce, and one of us had to brake, or both of us had to brake to make sure that, you know, this collision doesn't happen. But I found myself being disappointed that he decided to brake. And that's when I knew that, no, something is wrong. Chris is no longer fighting to stay on this beautiful planet.
And what was the response? What was going through your mind as that is all happening?
So the symptoms were there. I didn't know that I was prone, and a person so good looking as me could be prone to mental illness. I mean, you know, the stigma, as they say, but the signs were there, the telltales were there. I mean, I was spending time alone. A lot of time alone. I just wanted to be in bed. My appetite was no longer doing what it's supposed to do, especially if you're a foodie. And so those signs had always been there for the last couple of weeks, but I didn't know how drastic it was. I didn't know something was really wrong until that point in time after that almost collision. It's me pulling up to the side, to me literally bawling out of my tears and me having lost the reins. I had to call a couple of people. I had to call my sister. She had to come with a fiance at the time to come and drive me away because I could not continue driving. It was a proper breakdown. I then sought help after that. I then found out that this guy's name is PTSD. I was subscribed some medication, and I was subscribed a class or two to continue speaking with a therapist to just sort it out. And yeah, it was literally just a reaction, my body and my mental state as a whole, just saying, dude, slow down. A lot has happened. You have taken in a lot this year. You have not dealt with it. It's time we deal with it before we find ourselves in a big mess. And that's exactly what happened. It took some time, though. It took some time. This discovery happened around August. I could say that I was very comfortable in my own skin and in my own body around February 2019.
So there's that saying, don't look like what you're going through, right?
Yep.
And we try to keep up appearances, we try to keep it together, to hold it together so we don't look like what we're going through. So
Yep.
It is very common that people are going through stuff and they don't look it.
I no longer subscribe to Tigers Don't Cry. I no longer subscribe to Indota Ayikali. I no longer subscribe to Indota Ifelempini. No, this dude will talk.
My ailment, which is a three-headed monster called bipolar depression, that's bipolar 2, ADHD, which was diagnosed very late in life. And a lot of the time when people think of ADHD, they think of a little white boy with blonde hair jumping up and down, which is a misconception. It's not always about having too much energy. It's more about attention deficit and your mind processes things differently, and so your ability to perform tasks or to retain and process information is different from other people. And the last one is anxiety, and that was formally diagnosed in 2019. At the time, the diagnosis was severe depression and generalized anxiety. It was only maybe 2 years later, that would be last year, where my diagnosis was upgraded. And my psychiatrist, because when I first began, I started with a GP. And I felt like over time I needed somebody who was more specialized, who could help me, because I felt as though there were some things that were not being addressed, and I just needed somebody who specializes with the mind to have a look at me, assess me, so that I can be able to understand what truly is happening inside of my brain and my body. And that's when I was able to understand that, okay, what you're really surviving is bipolar depression, ADHD, and anxiety. And so since then, it's been a continued journey of, getting better. I was only formally diagnosed in 2019, or let's say 2021. But when I look back over the years throughout my life, I had been living with these ailments, but they had been undiagnosed. So when I look back now, I'm able to look back and say, that was definitely a severe depressive episode, or that was definitely a hypomanic episode, or the reason I wasn't able to, do so well in this subject was not because it was difficult as such, or because I didn't love it, but because, ADHD, or the reason I wasn't able to do this and that was because of ADHD. So now when I look back over the years, I'm able to pinpoint, traits and events and moments in my life where I realized that I had been struggling with these for a very long time, but because I had not had help, as you were saying that you were not able to deal with it because I was not dealing with it as well. It just actually became worse and worse, to the point where I had a breakdown, and then, I said, okay, well, something needs to change if I want to stay alive.
How was it? Did you have to transition like I had to? And how important was it for you to have constant support after that?
It was very important. So I had my many moments of packing everything up and saying, I'm leaving, I'm going home to my mother's house to lay my head on her bosom and just weep, and it was good for me in that I was able to be taken care of. But where I struggled with that, and where my family struggled with that, is that we didn't know exactly how to help me. And I think maybe the biggest issue was that I didn't know what I needed. And so they couldn't help me because they also didn't have the tools. So it was through, going through processes like therapy, the therapeutic process, seeing mental health professionals, support groups, that kind of thing. And at one point, hospitalization, that I was able to have a more clear-headed mind about my needs and what's happening with me and how to stay alive, basically. And to understand that, it's not necessarily that I am crazy. I'm not crazy. It's more about my brain processes differently. So my brain is working, my mind is working, but it processes things differently. It does have a deficit. English is not my mother. It does have a deficit in some aspects. And the easiest way I explain to people what is happening in my brain with all of the things that I have is to say that there's basically a failure to communicate. My neurons are not able to communicate. The communication systems is offline. It's not working. And so it needs help, medication, therapy, all of those things to help it kind of process some of the things that it's unable to process. So a lot of things that people are able to do without thinking, let's walk, breathe, at any given point in time, there are billions of neurons firing and telling you to do different things, breathe in, breathe out. And so when you have a depressed mind or a mind with mental illness, the communication system is jammed, it's offline. And so things like get out of bed are not being communicated, or if they are being communicated, the body is not receiving them, and so you find yourself able to wake up, and you're like, this should be easy, people do this without thinking about it, and people look at you and they say you're lazy, and you're like, no, I just physically cannot, and you physically cannot. The chemistry of your body will not allow you to do some simple things sometimes. So the support that I needed included a multi-pronged approach, because it wasn't just one thing that was going to happen.
For you, how important was it to break the stigma first and make sure that you align the conversation so that you can come out with what you went through?
Well, first of all, I had to forgive myself. And part of, I'm sure you've experienced this, part of dealing with mental illnesses, you will have to forgive yourself over and over again. And not necessarily because you're a bad person or you've done something wrong, but because you have so much shame and you carry so much shame inside of yourself for things that you cannot do, that you find other people are able to do easily. And so you forgive yourself because you're like, I'm just different, I'm okay. And you forgive yourself just so that your mind can process the fact that you are okay. It's okay not to be okay, but you're still okay because you're here. And that's the most important thing. But one thing that I realized beyond self-forgiveness, beyond breaking down the shame for myself, were the questions I was getting from other people. And I was surprised the most at questions I was getting for people who are millennials and Gen Zs. I expected questions from my mother's generation, the boomers. My mom was particularly worried about me being addicted to antidepressants. And then I had to say, no, that's not how it works. It's very unlikely that you will be addicted to antidepressants because it's not an addictive substance in and of itself. And so, explaining those kinds of things came with speaking to my doctor, doing my own research. But when I started to get questions from people who are like us, I was like, well, this means that nobody knows anything. And I was pretty shocked because, information age, we're always on the internet, we're always tweeting, finding out stuff about stuff. So I didn't expect that kind of ignorance and stigma at this level amongst our own peers. And that's when I said, I need to do something about it. I need to research for myself, but I think I need to write about it. The result of that was Broken Porcelain, which is my own mental health, my own mental illness journey. But it's also looking at society in general and how we receive or reject, mental illness, and basically how we deal with it. And it also talks about things like generational trauma and how that can be passed down and affect how we're able to be, to show up in life or not show up in life. So for me, it's very important that I just keep the conversation going and rolling amongst people who are even our peers.
We have an official superhero on the line to help us deal more and deal better with mental health and mental illnesses. Her name is Charity Mkone. Charity, how are you doing today?
I'm doing okay. Thank you very much for having me. Very important topic.
All right, total awesomeness. Thank you for making the time to come and help us just break stigmas and just understand this beast better. Bonnie did mention, look, there's a lot of research that has to go into this. There's a lot of professional help that has to go into this. And I believe this is the call for Masiviwe. It is a time for us to be heard, and also maybe making sure that we are articulating the right messages out there. Because I don't know if you've noticed, but on the Twitter streets, you know, on Facebook, on Instagram, everyone who knows someone happens to be a professional when it comes to mental health. People are loosely throwing around words like depression and anxiety and mental illness, but half the time, or 88% of the time, it is the wrong message going out there. And this is why we are doing what we are doing right now. You just are gonna be the superhero this afternoon and just help us break down the stigmas. And I think just maybe to touch base from what Bonnie and I were talking about a second ago about the stigma, you know, for me, keeping it to myself and keeping it between a close circle was a choice I made because of stigma. Negets have a stigma, you know, but how in our communities and families and amongst friends and our circles, how is it that we can break down the stigma? How is it that I can let people know that, hey, mental conditions have nothing to do le gore motho wa tshanya? How can we go about doing that and doing that better?
I mean, you ask a very important question, because I think the issue of stigma is about people not being educated enough about what mental illnesses are and a real illness. So the same way that someone can have cancer, or the same way that someone can have a broken leg or have diabetes or hypertension, it is a real illness and treated. And I think sometimes we illegitimize, we don't make it legitimate as a real illness. So people, it's okay to say certain tropes or certain things about it. And I think a big one is about changing the way we speak about it socially. And I think calling people out. So if you're sitting at a dinner party or whatever, the Twitter seats, and someone says, oh, this person is so bipolar. And what I mean by that is that their mood swings are very different, but that's far from what bipolar disorder or bipolar depression is. And I think it is about being able to speak about it in a very respectable way, and also in a way that will keep people informed. So a lot of people will say, if they wake and have a day, it just does seem like it's something that's part of our language and something that we use, that then I think takes away the power of seeing it as a disease, as a real disease, because if we see it as a disease, like it is, it should be treated. So if someone is diabetic and makes jokes about it, you don't say to a diabetic, oh, just give her it. Because your pancreas is not producing or doing what it should do, just get over it. Or pull yourself together. What do you have to be, I don't know, sad about? Okay, so it's the same thing. I think there needs to be a lot more education. And I think the more people have these disorders and speak about it, it does break the stigma. And I think it's more rife than people think. The percentages of people suffering with depression, bipolar, PTSD, all those things really high, but we don't know about it because people don't speak about it. And the advocacy about it doesn't just need to come from professionals, because when it just comes to us, it does seem like just textbook stuff that we're talking about, the very expensive education. But when people who suffer from these things actually can speak out, particularly people who've received help for it, to say what has this been like and how to break the stigma, is in sufferers of these illnesses who've received to speak about the positive journey. Because we often hear about, when it comes to mental illness, is a celebrity or someone who's committed suicide. But we don't get the story of how they've suffered with depression for many, many years, battled with it. Actually, it's gone untreated for very long, and that has led to suicide. So the stigma is for people to speak out, and people who have been on the receiving end mental treatment is what is most important.
Can you explain for those who don't seem to be able to get a grasp around what we're talking about, what mental health is and what mental illness is, because you made a very good example of physical health and how everybody has physical health. And when you get sick, that's when we say you have cancer or this and this and such a thing. So we understand that we all have mental health. And when our brain gets sick in a particular way, you may have PTSD or you may have bipolar depression, whatever. But in a very simple way, can you break down for us what mental health is and what we mean when we say that, and what mental illness is and what we mean when we say that?
All right. So in terms of mental health, what it means is that everything is as it should be. Okay. So someone who's not a diabetic means that your pancreas and all the systems in your body are doing what they need to do naturally. All right. So when we speak about mental health, we mean that whatever happens, so whatever external stimuli or external circumstance happens, you will experience certain emotions, you'll experience certain things that might look like a mental illness. I'll give an example about it, that someone experiences a loss of a loved one, or like we're speaking about PTSD, if someone has a very traumatic event. It's not everyone develops PTSD. It's not everyone who develops depression after a loss. So mental health means that the systems in your brain and the things that make help you to bounce back, so to speak, from life adversaries and things like that, means that there's mental health. Okay, so people who are not able to respond really well to life circumstances or things that happen to them are said to have a mental illness. So mental illness is when the actual mechanisms in your brain are not able to do what they need to in order to essentially help you keep alive, help you wake up in the morning, get out of bed, even though you feel a bit sad, you don't sink into that sadness and it doesn't feel like it overtakes your life. For it to be called or be classified as an illness is when it takes over your daily functioning, activity of daily living, and things that you just need to do to stay alive. And the thing with mental illness is that it's not just about the systems in your body. So it's a connection of circumstances, so external circumstances and things that happen to us, as well as our brain, the chemicals in our brain. So the interplay is quite a complex one, which then will tell how you respond to certain events or certain things that happen in life. So it's sort of a chicken and egg situation. Okay, so it means that there's something in your brain that doesn't do what it's supposed to. Certain neurons, like you mentioned, that are not firing the way they should, or certain chemicals that are not doing what they need to. And if that is met by traumatic life experiences, things that are out of our control that happen, then it's triggered. So I think it's very important to see and understand that it's a dual process. So it's two systems that rely on each other. And sometimes it's triggered by life circumstances, or sometimes the functioning of our brain is life circumstances. So for example, if you're depressed and able to get out of bed and go to work, then you lose a job, and so the cycle goes. So it's very important to recognize some of the life events that trigger mental illness, and that people will respond differently given the mechanisms in their brain and their propensity towards mental illness.
All right. And then in terms of dealing with our mental health, whether diagnosed or maybe not yet diagnosed or not even diagnosed, is there a way or are there ways in which we can take better care of our mental health? And what are those ways?
I think a lot of times people use prevention is better than cure for their physical health. You go for checkups, you go for whatever it is to check everything is okay. But people seldom do that for their mental health. And remember that mental illnesses are like any other illness, that most of the time people come when they are at the end of everything, particularly when it comes to therapy or counseling, as most people know it. Counseling needs to be something that is a check-in more than it is something that is a rescue. Okay, so with mental health, you need to be proactive more than you are reactive. So the point at which you seek mental health or mental interventions from from specialists needs to be from the onset. So with psychotherapy, what I say is that people always need to check in with themselves. So if you recognize that you've been feeling that has been happening for many, many months, and there's nothing that helps in terms of cheering you up, then instead of waiting until you have a suicide attempt or waiting until you admit into a hospital, to do a check-in, to book a session with the psychologist. Sometimes you don't even need to have something big happen, but just to check in that everything is as it should be, especially with events and circumstances that happen. So if you know that you've lost 10 family members within a space of 1 year, of course, you're not supposed to just continue with life as normal happens. So even if it feels like everything is okay, when bad life circumstances and unfortunate life circumstances happen, you need to be proactive about it and don't wait for it to take over life. You need to take control of it before it brings down to your knees.
Just very, very important. You mentioned getting help and how getting help will help you along with maybe getting medication once it is prescribed to you, to help you get over the line, to get you back and running the way that you should be, the way that your mind should be working as well. But about this help, about the support, where can we go to get help and support? I mean, if I find myself in a situation where I can tell that something is wrong, I need to get help. Where do I go for this help and the support?
I think ideally, the ideal is that there should be a psychologist and a psychiatrist for every community, everywhere you go. But the reality is that there's a shortage of psychologists and psychiatrists and just mental health practitioners in general. So we end up outsourcing and using resources like the South African Depression and Anxiety Group. They're a great resource and they provide psychoeducation. Yeah. So if you go to their website, there's more information about what all of these illnesses that we've spoken about are, some of the things that you need to look out for in terms of symptoms and signs of whether you're suffering from this. And they're also helplines. So the South African Anxiety and Depression Groups has 24-hour hotlines where you can speak to a counselor and they would be able to refer you appropriately because they have a database of psychologists and psychiatrists that you can go and see. But I think the first port of call, education. So for people to be educated on what it is, equip themselves in order to know what's the necessary intervention and necessary help that they need with these circumstances or conditions.
Charity, can you tell us a little bit about how loneliness impacts us as a society and what the very real effects of loneliness are on our minds and our bodies?
I think loneliness is quite a big one because as human beings, we are social beings. So the example that I like to use to drive the point home is that if you do something wrong, say when incarcerated or in prison, you're taken to solitary confinement, right? Where you're just by yourself because they realize that it's the worst kind of punishment that one can give because of our nature as human beings and our proclivity towards with others and experiencing change of being known and knowing others. But I also think there's another kind of loneliness where you are around people and surrounded by people, but still feel alone. So in terms of loneliness, not about being by yourself or living by yourself, but it is about the quality of people that you surround yourself with. And I think it's quite important for you to have one or two people that you're able to share your emotional life with and share aspects of your life with them. It's not about the number of people or how many people you have around you, but about the quality. Because as human beings, we have different facets to us. We have our intellect, our mind, we have our spirits, we have souls. So there's an important factor for us to be able to cater to those different parts of ourselves, to find different people in which we can be able to engage with on a deeper and more vulnerable level with some of the things that plague us and some of the things we find to be challenging, particularly when we have circumstances that feel like they're out of our control in our lives. It's important to just have that person who you can be honest with. And sometimes you can't find a friend or a loved one that you can do that with, to do it with a therapist. And just so you have someone who truly understands what you're going through and you can be honest with.
How do we get over what will people say syndrome? Because a lot of the time we say, feel free to approach people, to reach out to the resources that you do have, feel free to approach a mental health professional. But a lot of us have this what will people say syndrome. So what is the most important thing to remember about approaching people when we fear being judged?
I mean, this is very blunt truth, but the truth is that people don't care, and not in a way that people don't take concern if you're struggling, but every single person is so much more concerned about what's going on in their own life. And sometimes the people who we think are looking and interested in what's going on actually are so consumed with what they're going through and what their lives are like. So I often tell my clients and I tell people that actually the people that you're so concerned about are concerned about themselves, and they're concerned about what you think about them. So it's something that's quite liberating and sometimes quite sad, but mainly liberating because you realize that people just don't care. Most people have so many things going on for them, and they are thinking what you are thinking, and you are thinking what they're thinking. So it's important to be able to live each other in understanding that people, it's our nature for us to be self-centered. Believe it or not, we are just built in that way that what's most important to us is ourselves. So it's important to keep that in mind when you start to worry and fixate on what other people will say.
How is it that I can go about educating the people around me? I mean, my friends. How can I go about educating my family, maybe the immediate people that I live with at that point in time, so that we make sure that going forward, this is not treated as someone who is crazy. Just because someone is taking meds for their mental health, they are not crazy. This is us maybe going above and beyond to even make sure that we break down the stigma. How would you advise someone to educate the people around them?
I think part of what is happening in this platform and right now is for people to share their own experiences. So people who've went through a journey, if you've been to a therapist, to let people know how your experience was like, because people have really wild ideas about what happens when you get to a psychologist, what happens when you go to a psychiatrist, what happens when you are admitted, say, to a psychiatric unit, and people think that you're straight limited and what happens. So explaining your own experiences with how you feel like you've been helped by mental health practitioners, and being able to share what the process is like and what to expect. So if it comes from other lay people who are not mental health practitioners, it's received better, because then people don't have that fear, because they know of someone who's been to a psychologist and that person has explained to them how it's like. And it's a lot better, and people understand it so much better when it comes from someone who's received mental health care than someone who gives it, so a professional, because then it feels like it's so far removed. It's something that is so far from them in their experience. But if they hear it from you, who's been to a psychologist, who's been to a psychiatrist, then they're able to see that it's accessible and it's something that anyone can do, and it's not as scary as people think it is.
Yeah.
Before you go, would you please let the people know where they can find you and what it is that you do and what your specialty is?
All right. So I'm a clinical psychologist practicing in private practice in Johannesburg. And I have a website, which is www.charitymkonepsychologist.co.za. And that's where you find out more information in terms of where I'm based and the ways in which I work.
Charity Mkone, thank you times a million for joining us this afternoon.
Thank you so much for having me and for having this platform to present such an important topic.
Oh man, thank you so much. Have yourself a fantastic afternoon, right? If you have not yet liked, commented, followed, or even shared any of the posts, do make sure that you do so on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook. It is at MasiviweZA.
Please remember to interact with us on the internet, and that's at MasiviweZA. We're ready and willing and excited to hear your questions, comments, and stories.